Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for attending our third Tech and event of 2022. I'm Dr. Divya Sridhar, Senior Director for Data Policy at SIIA. Just a bit about SIIA. SIIA is the principal trade association for the software and digital information industries worldwide. SIIA's membership includes more than 400 software companies, search engine providers, data and analytics firms, and digital publishers that serve nearly every segment of society. SIIA is dedicated to creating a healthy environment for the creation, dissemination, and productive use of information. We believe in advancing meaningful consumer privacy protections that complement the responsible use of emerging technologies. Our Tech and series brings together policymakers, thought leaders, and a diverse array of voices addressing key policy issues facing the global digital economy and innovation. So you may be wondering where we stand on the topic at hand today. Advancing digital equity is a core focus of SIIA's work. Digital equity requires funding, resources, as well as upskilling and training opportunities for underrepresented communities where broadband access and related supports are lacking and yet so critical. We believe that digital equity will ensure civic and cultural participation, employment, learning, and access to essential services, which are integral to a more connected and prepared workforce in order to ensure lifelong success. Newly released data from the 2021 NTIA Internet Use Survey shows that historically less connected communities are using the internet and connected devices in greater proportions than they did just 2 years ago. Despite this progress, substantial disparities are evident. Roughly 1/3 of unemployed Americans lack the foundational digital skills required for the estimated 75% of US jobs requiring these skills, according to a study by the National Digital Inclusion Alliance. So, how is the US working to bridge the digital connectivity and skills gap, which go hand in hand? Fortunately, a wide range of policy efforts are addressing these gaps today, including various programs in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. For the first time in history, the law defines digital equity and authorizes programs that will leverage NTIA's Internet Use Survey as a key reference point to identify the appropriate levels of funding that can support state and local governments and related stakeholders.
Let me do a quick intro. We have comments from Senator John Thune from South Dakota, who's the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Communications, Media, and Broadband on the Senate Commerce Committee, and he was kind enough to provide these pre-recorded comments to help set the stage for our conversation today. Thank you, Dan.
Hey everybody, glad I could connect with you virtually today. As you know, I chair the Subcommittee on Communications, Media, and Broadband on the Senate Commerce Committee, and it's been a passion of mine for a long time to work to build out broadband networks and to lay the groundwork for 5G. There's a lot of money in the pipeline for building out broadband in this country. We need to make sure that it's spent wisely and well. And that means making sure that it's used to serve unserved and underserved areas, that we aren't overbuilding with these dollars. Secondly, that we're not imposing really burdensome regulations like requiring companies in order to qualify for the funds to impose rate regulation or net neutrality, things like that. And so we're going to work really hard to make sure that as the dollars are implemented out there, they're done in a way that maximize and optimize the number of people who can participate. Last year also, the Senate passed and we got signed into law my Telecommunications Workforce Act, which is designed to create more workers for these next generation jobs that are available out there. And we're going to continue to focus on that issue as well. We just appreciate everything that SIIA does to support those efforts to advocate on behalf of policies that help advance the cause of broadband networks across this country and making sure that people everywhere in the United States have access to high-speed internet services. Thank you for what you do. We look forward to working with you. Have a great conference.
Thank you so much, Senator Thune, for your leadership on this issue. Without further ado, now we'll move on to introducing and turning it over to Jeff Joseph, SIIA President, for the fireside chat with Larry Irving. So over to you, Jeff.
Thanks, Debbie. It wouldn't be the continuation of these strange times if we didn't have technical issues on an online conference. But without further ado, I'd like to welcome our guest. Larry, we're so fortunate to have you today. You need no introduction given all of your groundbreaking efforts in this space, but for those of you who are new to the discussion, Larry Irving holds a coveted spot in the Internet Hall of Fame and was the first to coin the term the digital divide. Larry's well known for his role as Assistant Secretary of Commerce for NTIA, among others, as well as his leadership in addressing digital divide and equity issues. Larry currently serves as chair of the board of Northwestern University and PBS. And interestingly, he's also a member of the board of directors of the famed Second City comedy troupe, which calls for a separate discussion on its own. So without further ado, let me introduce Larry Irving.
Thanks, Jeff.
There you are. I see you.
It's an honor to be here. Thank you so much. And thank you, SIIA. I know your membership well, and it's a great group of companies.
I appreciate that. We're so pleased to have you here today. I want to dive into a discussion regarding recent efforts to close the digital divide, promote digital equity, but I think we should start with a sort of a broader lens and that I think are related. And an easy question to begin with, and that is, how would you describe the state of race relations in the U.S. today, and how does that state, your view, figure into our efforts to close the digital divide and address equity?
You know, last week I was reading something, and I was not aware that last week was the 68th anniversary of the passage of the Brown versus Board of Education case. And I've lived most of those 68 years. I'm in my mid 60s. I always kind of thought that the curve was going up and to the right, that we're getting better as a nation. But when you look at the hate crimes, anti-Semitic crimes, where we have a problem with Stop Asian Hate, where we're going to probably see retrenchment on efforts to on affirmative action by the next Supreme Court, where a senator stated out loud that he had a concern that the Loving and other cases maybe they should be determined at the state level. When another senator said last week that, well, we don't have a problem with regard to mortality for women who are pregnant if you exclude Black women. There's just so much going on, and things that used to be said privately are being said out loud. I worry that we're retrenching as a nation. The closest thing, I'm a history and poli-sci major, the 1876, we had Reformation, and then we had Reconstruction in 1876. And for the better part of a century, we didn't do as well as we should on race relations. I don't think we're that far off, but I do think that we've got some issues that we need to address as a nation. We're going to be a nation that's majority minority in 2040, by 2044, 2045. But when you look at digital equity, and it's one of the things that spurred my interest. The folks who are least likely to have access to telephones in the 80s, which is where I first got started, and to broadband access today, are immigrants. They're people whom English is their second language. They're Black communities. They're particularly the rural poor. Dominique Harrison, who we both know, did a report last year, just October, that 40% of rural Black Southerners don't have access to broadband. That compares with 18% across the nation, 23% for white Southerners, white rural Southerners, 22% for African Americans overall. And then when you go to tribal land, we're looking at some places that 50 to 75% of tribal residents don't have access to broadband. And what frustrates me and kind of frightens me, if it wasn't for the pandemic, we wouldn't have addressed those issues. The only thing that got this nation really focused on it was that pandemic. And I think all of us who are on this call remember that iconic photo of those two young Latino girls sitting in Silicon Valley, home of some of the wealthiest people in the world, some of the more technology than any place on the planet. And you had two little girls trying to get their schoolwork done by sitting outside of Taco Bell. I went to Stanford up the street where there's all kinds of technology and all kinds of wealth. How do those little girls get to a Stanford? How do those little girls get to San Jose State or UC Berkeley or Santa Clara College if we don't make these investments today? So I am glad that we're making those investments. I'm sad that it took a pandemic for us to really focus on the societal inequities that we have.
Through the digital lens, absolutely. And in some ways, they're just a different viewpoint of those inequities that have existed for since the birth of the nation, just exacerbated perhaps by the digital lens. Somewhat related, Larry, 2 weeks ago, we saw the horrific and tragic hate-motivated mass murder in Buffalo. The killer live streamed the incident on Twitch, which did quickly pull the video, but it was since reposted and shared. His manifesto, I think, is on a couple other sites. So we have that. And then meanwhile, we're anxiously awaiting the Supreme Court ruling regarding the Fifth Circuit Court's recent move to reinstate the Texas social media law. For those of you who don't know, this law would make it unlawful for companies to censor a user based upon the specific content of their post, even if that content is clearly objectionable. objectionable. So how do you think we can balance all these competing interests, combating hate and other speech that online that leads to violence, ensuring a robust marketplace for free discussion, and while preserving the ability of private companies to govern their platforms and products? There's a lot of tension there.
There's a lot of tension there. Let me start with Texas. I also serve on the board of the Texas Tribune, so I've been following that very closely. Because there's a news media organization, public media organization in Texas. We follow everything that happens in Texas. So I looked at that law early, and candidly, I thought it was, and I think that the authors thought that this isn't going anywhere. This is clearly unconstitutional. Can we imagine a scenario in which 50 states plus assorted territories all have their own read on how tech companies and social media platforms should behave? I mean, that's it's unthinkable.
Unless you count privacy law.
Unless you count privacy law. If you're Twitter, if you're Facebook, if you're Snap, if you're TikTok, if you've got to ascribe to 50 different state whims and caprices with regard to that, but also it's antithetical to our First Amendment these are not common carriers. Even you can call them a common carrier, but they're not a common carrier under any definition. I don't think that it'll withstand Supreme Court scrutiny. And if it does, we really are in for a world of hurt in terms of how these platforms behave. But the deeper problem is we've never figured out a way to ensure that these public town squares, these electronic public town squares, are civil and are reasonable. We haven't figured out how to walk that. What's the right way? For those of you who have HBO Max, I encourage you to watch George Carlin. There's a 2-hour documentary on George Carlin. I was watching it over the weekend, and we've been dealing with these issues forever, going back to Carlin and 7 Dirty Words. But his thing was, he doesn't like. His point, one of the points he made is he doesn't like orthodoxy of any kind, orthodoxy on the left or orthodoxy on the right. And I'm decidedly left, but I don't want somebody on the left making decisions as to what I can see, hear, or read. And I don't want people on the right saying how I can see, hear, read. But when you're talking about calls to violence, when you're talking about anti-Semitic tropes, when you're talking about Nazism, when you're talking about hate speech, somebody should be ensuring that we have that no one's First Amendment rights are violated, but that we have civil discourse on these platforms. For 30 years, I've been fighting to get people on platforms. And as I think you and I said in a private conversation, I almost feel like somebody who was part of the Manhattan Project. Be careful what you wish for, because now you've seen all kinds of snakes and vermin crawling out from under the rocks and creating these own little subgroups. I don't think it's an accident that we've gone from under 2,000 hate crimes against African Americans in 2019 to almost 3,000 hate crimes against African Americans in 2020. I don't think it's an accident that we're almost 7,900 hate crimes against anti-Semitic hate crimes in the decade from 2010 to 2020. And I unfortunately know and believe that the internet and the anonymity and the communities created there had something to do with it. You and I both live in Washington, D.C., and I was at Comet Pizza the day after an idiot with a gun came in there looking for pedophiles in the basement of a place where I've gotten fried chicken and pizza and beers over the course of years. It is frightening that those kinds of things happen, but we haven't figured out a way to manage it. But I don't think the right way to do it is either to say everybody gets to say anything they want to, no matter who they are and what they're advocating. Nor do I think nor do I think we can tamp down views we don't agree with. I'm one of those people who believes that if you don't like speech, you round out with better speech. You don't necessarily just try to quell speech, and it may put me in a minority among some people on the progressive left. But I don't think I don't think we'll ever be a country that's going to completely say that some speech is unacceptable unless it's promoting violence or unless it's obscenity or pedophilia. Beyond that, I think there are things I don't like people saying. I think they have the right to say them.
So the easy question, of course, is then, so now what? Is that a role for private corporations? Are there sort of external boards to help govern and make this determination? Is it the proper role of government?
Government has a role. Government has a role, but the less government involvement you have, the less First Amendment problems you have. And so that's kind of the First Amendment is about government prohibiting speech. Right. As a private actor, whether you're talking about radio, TV, cable, editorial directors make editorial decisions. these platforms are more like that than they are like quasi-governmental entities.
Mm.
And I do believe that Twitter and Facebook and Snapchat and TikTok and Truth or whatever, Truth Social, all have their own right to help develop and determine what is going to be used and said on that platform and who can use it and when they can use it. And if you don't conform to the terms of conduct, then you probably shouldn't be on that network. Find someone where the terms of conduct are acceptable to you. But it does frighten me that a small group, a handful of people with a lot of economic power have that right. But that's always been the way we've had in America. If you owned a network, if you owned a broadcast, if you owned a newspaper, you had the right to say who was going to say what. You know, when I go to the Washington Post, I don't have an absolute right to have an editorial in the Washington Post. I've written letters that have been published. I've written letters that haven't been published. It's the way the game is played. And I think we're better with that scenario than having government say what isn't acceptable in terms of speech.
If you don't like the views of the Post, you can go to the Journal or elsewhere. If you don't enjoy the views
Financial
on
Times, Economist,
right?
Your local newspaper. And I think, if I don't like what's happening on Twitter, I go to Truth Social. If I don't like what's happening on Truth Social, I go to Parler. If I don't like what's happening on Parler, I go to Facebook. I think that's probably the better way, and let them determine their own marketplaces. Yes, I understand that some companies have more power than others, but to me, that in some ways, that's a market opportunity, not necessarily a market block.
That's well said. Well, let's dig into to some recent legislative activities. With the passage of the bipartisan infrastructure law, there's been a lot of emphasis, a lot of discussion on working towards digital equity, which was codified for the first time in law at both the state and the federal level. We've seen billions of dollars being put forth to begin to help close the divide, funding for schools, the recent E-rate announcement out of the FCC. What do you make of the funding that's been put forward under the infrastructure law? And how do you think those efforts need to trickle down to the state and local levels? What's the appropriate sort of process and divide there?
Well, I think that Congress and the White House administration got it pretty close to right. I mean, would I have put more money into it? Yes. And again, in my private conversation, I told folks that my only concern about what the administration is saying and doing is that this will end the digital divide. It won't. It won't come close. It will close some of the gaps. It'll get us further down the road. But I do worry that by saying, connect everyone and we're going to end the digital divide and we're going to get every American connected, we're raising false expectations. This is not enough money. It's probably a quarter to a third of the money needed to do what's needed across this country. That said, they're doing it right. And it's not about trickling down to the states and localities. What I think that what's so smart about what the administration is doing, what I think Alan Davidson and his team, from what I know, and I'm not inside NTI anymore, but from what I hear and from what my friends are telling me, they're looking for partnerships with states and localities. Because let's understand something fully. The failure for us to fundamentally address the problems of digital divide isn't a failure just at the federal level. It's also been a failure at the state and local level. Almost every policymaker in America deserves some blame for where we are as a nation with regard to having communities or individuals or whole swaths of the nation that are underprepared for this digital revolution that we're living through. By incorporating, I've always believed that solutions to problems are found closest to the problem. Localities and cities and states have a much better idea of what they need to do to solve these problems than anybody in Washington can. And one of the things the Department of Education is doing, that USDA is doing, that NTI is doing, and that our friends at the FCC, Jessica, in particular, Jessica Rosenworcel, the chair, is that they're looking to the states and the cities as they're trying to figure this out, but they're also working with local organizations. That's the smart way to do this. Dictates from on high. Clearly, you have to set the guardrails, but you need folks on the ground who understand what's really happening in those communities, that can really understand, that can decipher those maps. We all know that the mapping has been horrific. Historically. It still isn't solved. We've got a lot of work to do to get accurate mapping. But we also need to know the politics with the big P and the politics with the little p, of how to get people connected. And we also have to have people in those communities that are trusted by the people in communities, serving as advocates to folks. The digital divide has always been, they've always been fewer, even at the same income level. Blacks and Latinos and immigrant communities have always been undersubscribers compared to white Americans at the same income level. Part of that has to do with trust, part of it has to do with marketing. We need to figure out why those gaps exist, and we need to address them. And that's going to be done at the local level. So yes, the funding is going to come down from the feds, but the actual work and implementation, the hard work, that's going to be done in the localities and the states. And so, and I'll be honest, I've been a black man in America for a long time, and so I don't always trust states. When people say states' rights, it kind of
I hear you.
Doesn't always resonate with me.
Right, it's an underlying message there that doesn't make me very comfortable.
So I'm glad that the states are kind of sandwiched between the feds and the localities and community organizations and localities, so that people in those communities can talk about. I'll give an example. Last week in Texas, a bunch of federal dollars came to Texas. And the Secretary of State, who's running for office tomorrow, so I won't mention his name, Secretary of State in one of the federal officials in Texas, put more money in areas that aren't in the hurricane zone, but are whiter and more Republican than he did in Galveston and Houston, which were hurt by the hurricane zone. Those kinds of games that they're played with hurricane funding could easily be played with digital divide funding. So I'm hoping people are watching very carefully. And when we say we want the states involved, yes, we want them involved. They have to be involved. But there also has to be some folks in the local communities and folks at the Fed seeing how those dollars are being spent and make sure they're not being spent in a discriminatory fashion. And let me explain to you why that's so worrisome to me. We came with the digital divide in the 1990s. For 2001 to 2009, the words were not uttered by anybody in the federal government, whether that was a fiat or not. We're not going to talk about the digital divide because it seemed as a thing that was going to help poor people and black people and Latino people. You just didn't talk about it. To his credit, Ajit Pai and the most recent FCC resurrected the digital divide to some degree. But when they used the term, they used it very strategically and almost exclusively to talk about the digital divide as it affected rural Americans, as it affected folks that weren't connected in rural America. We weren't talking about the digital divide in black areas or brown areas or low-income areas. We were talking primarily about, the square states in the middle of the country, as we used to call it when I was on the Hill, that for geographic reasons didn't have access. We can't go back. What was so smart last year, there's a bipartisan infrastructure bill. What is so important, what was so smart, was that they went bipartisan, that they said we're going to take care of the underserved and unserved. We're also going to take care of people who don't have access because of poverty. I started using the term digital poverty because the digital divide was almost co-opted. And fortunately, we're able to combine the digital divide and digital poverty. But the biggest indicator of who's not connected to capacious broadband isn't geography, it's income. And if we don't focus on that, on the folks who are really poor, we're going to have a problem. We can get back to a scenario in some states where we only look at the unserved because of geography. That will still leave millions of Americans across this country who are underserved because of income. If we do both, it's great for America. If we do only one, we compound existing, to your point earlier, we compound existing inequities. If you already have a low education, low income, live in a community that's at risk, and then you're not connected to the internet, all of your other problems are compounded.
Right. and you're left out of the digital society. You raise a couple of interesting issues there. We talk about access, so clearly that's an issue, whether it's urban, rural, whatever. We talk a little bit about affordability, but there's more there. There's a study, I believe, in Baltimore where they sort of overlaid a map of broadband speeds over a traditional map of housing redlining, and the map's almost exactly mapped. And it wasn't that they didn't have access. It's that the speeds were slowed in those areas. So as we can talk about affordability, we talk about access, but there are other pieces here. What's the role of government in ensuring that it's not only affordable and accessible, but it's high quality and competitive?
Well, I mean, and again, I think the FCC and NTI have done a pretty good job. I mean, I'm a huge fan of Jessica, a huge fan of Jeffries. I think that they've got the right focus on these things at the commission. Alan is brand new in the job, but when I'm looking at what his staff has done, I think that they're doing the right things too. We're talking about if you want to get access to this federal money, you're going to have 100 down, 20 up. That's important. And they're basically going to ban digital redlining. I listened carefully to the senator talking about overbuilding, and I have a little bit of attention to that because one of the things that I do think the American Connectivity Program matters. Affordable Connectivity Program matters, and it is really, really important. But that requires tens of billions of dollars every year to keep people connected to a commercial network. I'm wondering if there aren't other ways, and Michael and others will have things to say about this, but are there ways to create infrastructure in those communities that don't require $360 a year for a family times millions of families every year? Because we're heading into a recession. We're going to either have stagflation or recession. I'm not an economist. I don't even play one, but I was reading Bloomberg just before I got online. If we're heading into a recession, are multi-billion-dollar programs for subsidization. Well, if $14 billion a year, if that's the number, or $10 billion a year over a decade, is $100 billion. Are we going to continue to, who's going to fund it? How are we going to fund it? We all know we have to rethink USF. We're still going to have to upgrade networks in rural and high cost areas. Where's the money coming from? How are we going to do it? What's the right expenditure in the front of this process? I'm on the board of Schools, Hospital, Library, Broadband Association, Shelby. We think the to and through, using schools, using libraries. Where I grew up in Brooklyn, the Brooklyn Public Libraries are doing amazing things, creating community networks. Are we using all of the tools in the toolbox? Are we thinking as creative as we can? Those are the things that, that keep me up at night. It would be, I can't imagine anything, the only thing worse than connecting people, than not connecting people now, would be to connect them and then have them lose that connectivity in 3 to 4 or 5 years because we're no longer funding it, or because we've solved the problem, whatever. How do we keep these programs up and going? There are going to be poor people in this country for at least the next 5, 10, 15 years. They're going to still need broadband. Are we looking in the out years, how we're going to fund this, how we're going to sustain these programs? I'm not hearing enough of that, but I am seeing really good, smart thinking at the FCC, at NTIA in terms of digital redlining, making sure that everyone is served. I'll give you one statistic that surprised me 2 years ago. I was doing a Zoom call like this, getting ready to do a call with the New York State Broadband Office. And I did some research. Fully 40% of small businesses in New York City didn't have access to a gig network. 40%. 40% 2 years ago did not have access to a gig network. 40%. They're almost entirely in Black neighborhoods or Latino neighborhoods, and some in immigrant neighborhoods. But it was the Bronx, it was Brooklyn, it was Southeast Queens where I grew up. It was communities of low-income communities of color, 40%. Now, how are you possibly going to be a participant in this economy, a full participant in this economy, when 4 out of 10 small businesses in New York City don't have access? And at the same time, I was doing some work with GoDaddy.com that has a micro ventures initiative that folks don't know about, they should learn about, trying to make sure that, because a lot of, the side hustle for a lot of folks, like I grew up in a community where everybody had a side hustle because, 9 to 5 jobs were harder for folks to get. A lot more of those side hustles were online. And you were seeing all kinds of economic opportunities where people did have access to broadband. But one of the greatest impediments to folks, get during the pandemic to making money was access to broadband. And in New York City, it was 40%.
It's insane. For the macro level, it's important at the local level, but how are we going to compete in this global economy if we're leaving 40% of the world's greatest cities behind without access? And
understand that 40% is younger than the average demographic, because that 40% is disproportionately immigrant, disproportionately Latino, disproportionately Black, disproportionately Asian, who are still younger than the white cohort for the most part in America. So not only are we depressing 40% of the city, we're depressing the youngest 40%.
Right.
And in many ways, it's the future of our nation.
Exactly.
When you look at these numbers, you're just like, what are people thinking? And if your companies, and I've consulted a lot of companies, don't you understand that Black folks, brown folks, Asian folks, we overpredict in terms of how we spend money on these products when they're available. And that was always one of the things that, when I was doing more straight consulting, it's like, dude, you're leaving money on the table. You're hurting your country. You're also hurting your shareholders.
Yep. Absolutely. We have about time for one more, because I do want to set up the rest of today's discussion. We sort of danced around this a little bit, but it's in your thoughts on some of the gaps in equity when it comes to, we've talked about access and affordability and in redlining, but when it comes to access to workforce related and upskilling and overall training, thoughts on investments that can be made from the federal level that may address this, or back to your point, the funding coming from the federal and then local control, and are there any models in place that you've seen that are particularly compelling and interesting?
One of the things we need to do, and I think one of the things that's going to happen, is we need to talk more to the younger cohorts in all of these communities. Grandparents should listen to their grandchildren, and it's the young folks, it's the entrepreneurial folks, it's the folks on the ground in those communities that are going to make the difference in terms of training. I don't know of any, I do know of some, but I don't want to throw out any one particular model. But what I do hope that the NTIA will do is that they'll think more broadly than just connecting and making sure that we're doing digital training. I want to give you one statistic that I read 2 days ago. That 65% of medical devices will be connected or connectable by 2025. 68%. I have family members now who are on heart monitors. I have family members now who have diabetic problems. You look at the problems in low-income neighborhoods and tribal reservations. A lot of them are health. I know a lot of your companies are in med tech. are we thinking, as we're using the $65 billion to connect people, are we thinking about how these dollars can be used in ed tech and med tech in ways that aren't being thought of right now? The first digital divide report came about because I went to Ron Brown, the Secretary of Commerce, and said, I got 45 million with an M dollars. I'd like to use some of it to work with the Commerce Department to just create some pilot program, just to do this program where we figure out who's connected, not connected, because that'll help inform how we should spend those dollars. If 1% of what Alan has, which is $48 million, if 1%, that would be 450 million, 1/10 of 1% would be 45 million, larger than my entire grant program, to start doing some interesting digital equity issues, job training. I'm pretty sure that he could talk to the Secretary, talk to Congress about how do we get into these communities, tribal communities, immigrant communities, rural communities, and get the smartest young people in those communities thinking about digital training, but also thinking about what do our communities need in terms of healthcare? What do they need in terms of education? What do they need in terms of access to government programs? What do they need in terms of agricultural areas? Just some pilot programs that are smart and innovative. I'm hoping Alan and his team will do that. I don't know that they will. I hope the Secretary Raimondo would say what Secretary Brown said to me, which is go for it. And we're willing to take this. Some people in Congress might be unhappy, but innovation requires courage, and courage requires change. And change is, let's get some smarter, younger people closer to the ground to close these problems, to look at the issues that you're talking about. How do we get the digital workplace where we need it to be? But how do we think about medtech in a different way in an era where 68% of medical devices are now connected to broadband? That's and then think about the other side of that. 68% are connected or connectable, and too many places in our country, people can't get the connection.
Yeah. It's literally a matter of life and death.
Literally a matter of life and death. And for people who have the worst health outcomes and the worst health, the comorbidities in our nation, we can do better, and we have to use these tools in a way we're not using them right now.
It begins to resolve the lack of access issue, right, to quality healthcare, monitoring. I mean, just on and on. The overall takeaway here is this is literally not only a matter of life and death. It's a economic life and death, right? We can't leave all these people behind. Now, I have so many other questions I could chat. I will follow up with coffee, and I'll have this discussion offline.
I look forward to it, and I'm looking forward to the next panel because these people are smarter than me. They're doing it every day. I just do it occasionally. I'm busy being on boards. They're busy doing stuff.
Well, you all should know some of the work Larry's doing in his board positions and how he's helping promote equity in a variety of ways and address these issues. So, Larry, thank you so much for your time. We greatly appreciate your being here, and I look forward to catching up.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Well, now it is time for our panel discussion. Our moderator is Nicole Ferraro. She's the site editor of Broadband World News and host of The Divide. Nicole, thanks for being here today. And as we hopefully set you up well, we're excited to hear your discussion.
You set me up very well. That was an excellent conversation that I would have liked to listen to for another hour, but I do have the honor of hosting our expert panel today. So I'll transition to that. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you so much for having me as your moderator. I'm going to introduce our wonderful panelists in just a moment, but just to set the stage for our conversation, I wanted to share a couple of additional statistics that highlight the problem we're trying to solve here with regard to the digital divide, our students, and the future workforce. So current data shows that an estimated 16 million students in the US lack access to a broadband connection. It's fair to assume that number is larger, given, as Larry mentioned, we're still working with pretty bad, outdated federal data when it comes to quantifying the digital divide. As Divya mentioned, there was a recent NTIA study that showed that the digital divide has narrowed over the last couple of years, thanks to pandemic relief and an effort to actually close the digital divide. However, there are still substantial disparities between communities with low-income households and non-white households less likely to have access to both fixed and mobile internet, as well as laptops and tablets. Meanwhile, and simultaneously, research is warning about the impact of digital skills shortages on the workforce and economy. A study from Data People showed that tech job posts nearly doubled in 2021, but the average number of applicants shrunk by 25%. And according to a survey by Forrester, the biggest skills gap is data literacy. So closing the digital divide is crucial to level the playing field for students so they can succeed to their fullest potential, and for the US to remain globally competitive. Fortunately, the bipartisan infrastructure law, which I might refer to as the bill, BIL, reserves $65 billion to solve broadband deployment, access, and equity problems. I won't list out all of the provisions because we'd never get to our panel, but they include massive infrastructure grant programs like the $45 billion Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program, also known as BEAD, and the $14.2 billion Affordable Connectivity Program, which I think we'll talk a bit more about later. The law also brings digital equity into focus by defining it in statute for the first time, as Jeff mentioned, and it requires the FCC to write rules that would end digital discrimination, also known as digital redlining. So there's a lot to unpack here, and we have the perfect group of people here to help us do that. So I'm delighted to welcome our panelists today, and they can each come on video and off mute. Jisoo Song, Broadband Advisor at the U.S. Department of Education, Heather Gate, Vice President of Digital Inclusion at Connected Nation, Rosemary Lahaski, Senior Director for Government Affairs at Cengage, and Michael Calabrese, Director of the Wireless Future Project and Senior Research Fellow at New America. So welcome to all of you. I'm really honored to get to have this conversation with you today. So let's get right into it and hear a bit from each of you about the state of the digital divide for students in the US. Jisoo, we'll start with you from your perspective at the Department of Ed and from the digital equity education roundtables you all are doing. Can you give us a sense of the digital divide's impact on students in the US? Where is it having the biggest impact on students? And what are you hearing from schools and communities about what their needs and obstacles are?
Yeah, but happy to take that question. First of all, thank you so much for having me on this panel. I think we can start with the consensus that the pandemic really highlighted the impact of the digital divide from home, as you mentioned through your statistics. From an education perspective, we know that students who lack access to the internet from home exhibit lower digital skills attainment, homework completion rates, GPA, standardized test scores, and a number of other factors that last into post-secondary and beyond. We also know from recent data that this divide disproportionately impacts certain student communities the most, like our students of color, students from low-income backgrounds, as well as students from rural districts. And because of the leadership of our educators and some education leaders, we've seen some progress being made on this issue throughout the last 2 years through efforts like device and hotspot distribution, assistance to families in signing up for the Affordable Connectivity Program, school-based technical support help desks, and digital literacy trainings. Learning was able to continue somewhat when physical school buildings were closed. And as we recover from the pandemic, our educators are increasingly leveraging active and innovative learning opportunities made possible through technology. We're also seeing some schools accelerating their implementation of whole learner approaches with technology, including connections to social and emotional supports, parent-educator engagement opportunities, telehealth, telemental health, other basic needs services. So for those opportunities to become equitably and sustainably available at scale, we have to do more. So as the Office of Educational Technology at the Department of Education engages with digital equity, we're hearing from school and district leaders that it's not enough to make just broadband available and affordable, although those are critical steps, don't get me wrong. We also have to make sure that we're solving for the human barriers that often inhibit adoption by our end users. And here are 4 initial barriers that we're uncovering, and I think Larry actually mentioned a couple of them during his fireside chat. First, awareness and understanding of available programs and resources is critical. Second, signing up for available programs and resources can be challenging for a lot of families and students and cause confusion around eligibility, application status, distribution, and installment. So how can we make that process more simple and streamlined? Third, trust between communities and services is essential. For many communities, there's a historical lack of existing relationships between public and private sectors, as well as the constituents, along with concerns about data privacy, hidden or unexpected fees or future costs. And then lastly, building digital readiness and digital literacy among learners and communities can also bridge the adoption issue. So at the Office of EdTech, we're really encouraging leaders to think more than just the physical tools, more than just the physical infrastructure when it comes to digital equity for our students.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Turning to you, Heather, the common anecdote we hear about the digital divide is of students having to sit in parking lots to do their homework, which is terrible, right? We all agree that is terrible. But it's important to note that the digital divide is much bigger than that one anecdote. It has tentacles that go on to disrupt a student's educational development, digital literacy, and job prospects. And from your work with Connected Nation, you've had insight into this for years. So I was wondering if you can share a bit about what the digital divide looks like in the communities Connected Nation works with, and how those digital gaps go on to impact students over time.
Yeah, thank you, Nicole. So for over 20 years at Connected Nation, we've really been committed to helping communities as a whole, including schools, community anchor institutions, and the local government as well, in helping them tackle issues related to the digital divide, whether it is broadband mapping so they can more specifically identify where gaps are, or helping communities create their own broadband plan that really identifies the issues and comes up with tangible solutions for overcoming those barriers. We've also been helping communities overcome barriers to adoption by actual programming, whether it is programming, we've done programs such as No Child Left Offline that actually helps get devices into households. And this was many, many years ago. The idea behind that was to really not only introduce the device in the household, but to actually have a conversation about what broadband was and what the child could benefit, how the child could benefit, plus the family as well. As you know, in terms of devices being in the household, it's not only just a school issue, it is the parent's responsibility to, once that device comes into the household. So as everybody has talked about, we've made significant progress, but sadly, the COVID pandemic has been a reality check for all of us. And one thing that struck me was a study conducted by the Pew Research Center that showed that 46% of children encountered technology obstacles during the lockdowns. And these technology obstacles included that some of them only had a cell phone for schoolwork as a primary device. And this is 46% of kids from lower income households. So 46% of them had a cell phone as a primary device. They did not have access to a computer in the household and therefore had to find a public access computer, or they just did not have a reliable network at home. And so that was very startling for us. So going back to what Connected Nation does, one of the reasons that Connected Nation really takes a holistic approach to tackling the digital divide is that the digital divide itself is not a simple issue. And as Larry mentioned earlier, there's been different ways that people have defined digital divide to serve specific communities and specific purposes. For us, the digital divide is a really complex and a nuanced issue. And so in order to tackle the digital divide, you have to look at not only access to infrastructure, but you have to look at subscriptions, affordability that we talked about earlier, but also items related to basic skills, digital readiness, not only for the student, but family members, issues related to the actual internet-enabled devices that kids use at home, that these devices have to meet the students' needs. Issues related to whether the household has the level of service that meets their needs. For example, if a household has 4 kids and 1 parent working from home, do they have the connectivity to serve that household? And then issues related to support and advocacy from community anchor institutions, because ultimately when you have internet, the most meaningful use is how they're using applications and tools to achieve, whether it is education or telehealth or anything. And then finally, the digital divide is impacted by emerging technology. So we have to be willing to evolve in our definition of digital divide as time goes on. And so in terms of students, the digital divide affects them based on where they are in their communities and what the challenges are for that community.
Fantastic, thank you. Turning to you next, Rosemary, your organization Cengage offers digital learning products and workforce training resources and programs and related services for students. So given the past couple of years in particular, what impact is the digital divide and digital skills gap having on the current and future workforce and our preparedness to compete on a global stage? And how has your organization morphed its strategy, if at all, to keep up with this shift to digital?
Thank you, Nicole, and thank you to SIIA for having us, or having me. I really appreciate it. There is no question that digital skills are becoming increasingly necessary in all industries, not just IT. We're seeing massive workforce shortages happen all across industry. small employers to large employers. And so, we just think many of these jobs are going to require better digital literacy skills from all of our workers and all of our workforce. So it's a great need. We see it growing exponentially, and the gap is certainly alarming across the country. But I don't want to sort of look at it so negatively. I know this panel has sort of highlighted, I think, what some of the biggest concerns are, but there are some real opportunities, I think, here too. Automation and technology are drastically changing the workforce and the workplace itself. This means that there could be great opportunity for people who had been sitting on the sidelines for many years, people who didn't have access to the internet before, maybe people who had a disability and were unable to do certain jobs. They now will be able to perform some of these jobs. And so we sort of see it as a real opportunity, could have a massive impact on our global economy and our competitive advantage in the country if we're able to reach them and give them the skills necessary to do some of these jobs. At Cengage, we've gone through a massive transformation ourselves. We're a 100-year-old company. We've changed our name a couple of times. We used to be known as Thompson Publishing. We're an old textbook publisher, print publisher. But in the mid-2000s, we really transformed to digital content and really transformed all of our content digitally. We were the first to offer subscription services to college-level students, really drastically reducing the price of textbooks in this country and really allowing them to access all digital content on day one. Sort of to Heather's point, it's more than just the ability to sort of, gain access to online programs, but it actually impacts affordability as well. So we've been there, we've been doing it. We just did a survey of students across the country, and 70% of students want to learn online. They want to have some option of learning online. We primarily have been providing courseware and content in general education, but we've been increasingly providing more online courseware when it comes to career and technical education and vocational programs in this country. And many of the programs that were funded in the infrastructure of law, trying to grow construction, HVAC, those are things that now increasingly are being able to be conducted in part, if not totally, online. We have huge programs when it comes to HVAC and construction. We also have huge programs when it comes to cybersecurity, a job skill almost every single person in this country will need in order to perform in the decades to come. So we're really excited about some of these opportunities. We've sort of been on the cutting edge. There's obviously a lot of work to be done, but we sort of remain optimistic.
Great, we'll take optimism. I love it. Michael, turning to you now to reflect on some of what we've been hearing and talking about. You're a member of the Airwaves for Equity Coalition and an advocate for Congress to set aside revenue from spectrum license auctions to provide sustainable funding for a digital equity foundation. So tell me a bit about why that initiative is important and how it would help with the digital divide issues that we've been discussing.
Yeah, thanks, Nicole, for including me. And yeah, I'd love to do that. So the Airwaves for Equity proposal, in short, is to dedicate a substantial share of the net in the future, future net proceeds from the auction of the public airwaves, licenses to use the public airwaves, to invest sustainably in digital literacy and adoption, with a focus on breaking down those exact 4 barriers that Jisoo outlined. So we have this was put forward by, and I should mention first actually that the opportunity is that auctions for licenses to use the spectrum have raised more than $230 billion since auctions began in the 1990s, and yet only once has any of that money, which is ultimately paid by consumers, your smartphone bill, for example, only once has any of that been flowed back into the telecom sector for a public interest purpose. And that was in 2012, the last time Congress extended the FCC's auction authority. The first $7.5 billion went to establish FirstNet, the interoperable public safety wireless network. So we have a coalition. Some of the core partners are National Digital Inclusion Alliance, Schools Health Library Broadband Coalition, American Library Association, Common Sense Media, and 75 others organizations that have endorsed this. And really, the logic of it is that, in terms of its relevance right now, is that closing the digital divide is going to, involves really 3 A's. access, which is the broadband infrastructure. And Nicole, as you outlined, that's where more than 45 billion is going to build physical networks. Affordability, and that's the 14 billion in the Affordable Connectivity Program, and then adoption or inclusion efforts, which complement the other two. And they get, there's very little money available for that. But as President Biden noted a couple weeks ago in announcing this low cost initiative with internet providers, only 1 in 4 eligible households has enrolled in the Affordable Connectivity Program. So we need efforts to enroll them, to find them at least refurbished devices, to give them the digital skills training. And the trusted community-based assistance. There's also great benefits here for EdTech itself. So we've suggested that some of these funds, particularly if we can endow a digital equity foundation that makes sustainable investments year after year, there can be initiatives to close the homework gap more permanently, because the Emergency Connectivity Fund is about to run out. And so, we started with the homework gap, it became a remote learning crisis, and now we're going to go right back to those 16 million not having access. And also addressing digital equity gaps in EdTech itself. So examples include learner variability navigators for teachers to assess and address learning differences and deficits with the sort of whole learner approach that Jisoo mentioned. Digital Promise, ISTE, who's a core supporter of this, have talked about those, what Richard Collada calls, doing demonstration projects in lighthouse districts could leverage these funds to spur a lot more activity at state and district level that maybe even a single program couldn't afford. So that's it.
That's great points. And, as Larry mentioned before, this isn't enough money to close the digital divide. So any ideas for new funds, I think, are welcome. So I want to talk more about the actual bipartisan infrastructure law, or the BIL, to save some time, which, as we noted, contains $65 billion for broadband and several programs intended to solve the various issues causing and stemming from the digital divide. So Heather, I'm going to come back to you here. Which aspects of the broadband provisions in the BIL seem best positioned to help students? And how is Connected Nation collaborating with anchor institutions like schools and libraries to help them prepare for, understand, and effectively leverage this funding?
First and foremost, we are elated about the whole $65 billion package because it presents a comprehensive strategy of advancing digital equity and equal access. And as a matter of fact, that language is all over the bill, whether they're talking about the deployment of infrastructure itself or the Digital Equity Act. So that's great. And so, again, the thing that's great about that is that infrastructure is going to be deployed. We're going to have affordable service under the Affordable Connectivity Program. And with the White House's announcement from the last couple of weeks, some people may be able to get up to 100 meg free under that program, which is great. Again, as Larry said, we have to be thinking about sustainability, but putting that aside. And then last but not least, this is going to be the first time that states get funding to create digital equity plans, at least if they applied for it. And what that means is that we're going to have these programs that are interconnected. And as a matter of fact, the notice of funding opportunity that was released 2 weeks ago explicitly has language that says that the deployment programs and the digital equity programs ought to be linked, integrated, and complementary, which means that there's no excuse to not making sure that we tackle some of the issues that Larry discussed earlier in terms of low income and minority communities that have systemically been left behind in the digital divide. So to put it plainly, we can do this. We just have to have a local commitment to do this. And we also have to have participation from localities, from states as the recipients of the awards and at a federal level. So how are we helping community anchor institutions? Going back to your question, we help communities define the digital divide, going back to the fact that this is nuanced. We help communities build what we call community technology teams. And this is a team of community leaders that consist of anchor leaders and local government and everybody. And they come together to do a local assessment for the state of the digital divide. So what we recommend is that they be prepared and ready to articulate what the problem is in their community, whether it is in an urban community where the speeds may be slower, be ready to be able to clearly articulate where that is and what it is, or whether it is in a rural area where the problem is the infrastructure does not exist. So the other thing that we do is that we have a partnership with Funds for Learning where we aggregate E-rate data. And we created an online portal where administrators, superintendents, and directors and school leaders can go and explore competitive pricing and see what their state is doing, what others are doing, and the type of pricing that they're receiving for connectivity. And they can also go there to monitor their state's progress towards connectivity goals. So we are engaged with community anchor institutions, not only schools, but libraries and any organizations that are in the community that are serving the issue of the digital divide. We invite them to participate in community teams when we come into the communities to help them. And we want to make sure that they have the data and they have the language in order to advocate for themselves as these monies go out.
That is so crucial. I'm sure they feel very lucky to have your support. Jisoo, is there a policy or are there policies in the bipartisan infrastructure law that jump out at you as particularly important to closing the digital divide for students? And to what degree is the Department of Ed collaborating with the FCC and NTIA on rulemaking for these grant programs so that schools and other educational institutions benefit from all of this funding to the greatest extent?
Yeah, this is certainly a timely topic since our colleagues over at NTIA released a notice of funding opportunities for the broadband programs in the bill a few weeks ago. And there was that announcement from the White House on the Affordable Connectivity Program also a few weeks ago. By the way, if you haven't already, you should check out internetforall.gov for the NTIA programs and getinternet.gov for information about the ACP. But that aside, we're not directly involved in any of the rulemaking since those programs are run out of other federal agencies. But at OET, we're certainly interested in the state digital equity planning grants that Heather talked about. With these digital equity plans, states have an incredible opportunity to address some of the adoption barriers that I talked about in the previous question. So to help with these efforts, we've launched our initiative called our Digital Equity Education Roundtables, or DEAR for short, to inform leaders about adoption-related barriers that learners and families furthest from digital opportunities face. Starting at the beginning of this year, we held a series of roundtable conversations, hearing directly from organizations and groups that directly represent these learner communities, as well as families and students themselves. And we'll be using the insights that we've gathered through these events to develop a guidance publication that informs states about common adoption barriers for each learner community, strategies to get around them, and share some example stories of success as well. And we're hoping to release this publication in the fall so that states have our resource readily available as reference as digital equity planning proceeds. And simultaneously, we've been convening leaders from various sectors, from industry to philanthropy to education nonprofits, to discuss how each sector can contribute in our collective effort to close the digital divide. Certainly, there's a lot of federal investments in this area, but we know it kind of has to be an all-hands effort. So we're leveraging our perspective from the federal government and tools outside of the Big P policy that Larry mentioned to advocate for our vision to close the adoption gap.
Excellent. Rosemary, coming to you from a workforce perspective, what aspects of the infrastructure law do you think will be most impactful to workforce development and to solving some of the problems that you're encountering through your work at Cengage?
Yeah, you know, almost every single agency that received funding in the bill, I like that you call it the bill. At one point, we were calling it the BIF, which was terrible.
It has a lot of names.
But almost every agency that received funding did receive either direct funding for workforce training or were given the flexibility to spend some of their funding on workforce training, which was pretty phenomenal. And this wasn't just the Departments of Education and Labor, but this was the Department of Transportation, the Department of Energy, and obviously with the digital equity grants, we were looking at the Department of Commerce. I think, it sort of sends a very clear message that the government was sending, which is that employers and industry are integral to education and training in this country, and that we've got to do a better job of linking employment and education. And so that's sort of one of the biggest things I sort of saw coming out of the bill that's the most hopeful for workforce development. We are seeing, more employers are sort of having these conversations around developing curriculum, around developing training that's better linking training to on-the-job training or apprenticeships. We often have thought about apprenticeships as just being in the building and trades industry, but they're not. We're seeing growing and expanding apprenticeships in the digital economy. So companies like IBM and Google and Microsoft, just to name a few, are increasingly doing more apprenticeships and on-the-job work-based learning throughout their company. And then the other thing I think I really have been encouraged with this sort of employer-led approach to all of this is that a lot of companies are looking internally and trying to figure out how they can best find more talent, not through the traditional lens that we have often used for recruiting, which is the 4-year degree, but they are starting to look at more certificate programs and industry recognized credentials. A lot of this stuff is happening in all types of industries, but I'll be honest, it's really being led by sort of the tech community in a lot of ways. So it's sort of exciting. I think it's sort of a new way, a clear sign that this law was sort of saying, hey, industry has got to be an integral partner in all of this. So we're pretty hopeful in that regard.
Awesome. And Michael, coming to you now, I'm just curious overall what you think the infrastructure law gets right on broadband policy. And, knowing that you sit on the wireless side of things with the notices of funding opportunity, prioritizing fiber projects, do you still see a lot of opportunities for wireless and mobile projects to close the digital divide with this funding?
Right. So in terms of what they are getting right, a few of the things we really like, as I think Heather suggested, that the BEAD program requires states to first develop in an initial planning stage a 5-year state action plan for both infrastructure and equity, and to coordinate the two efforts. This is important because more households have not adopted broadband than don't have access. So adoption is actually the bigger problem at this point. Also, I think it's notable that the NOFO, in other words, the Department of Commerce plan, allows states to connect schools and libraries with gigabit fiber connections if they don't have them already, which was a big effort under E-rate that hasn't quite been completed. It allows deployment of Wi-Fi in multi-tenant buildings where apartments lack high-speed broadband access, that is 120. So that's really great because otherwise an area might be considered served because some of the single-family homes had cable or something, but apartments, where tends to be lower-income people live, do not. State plans must also include a middle-class affordability plan that offers at least one low-cost broadband service option. And since the internet service providers must participate in the Affordable Connectivity Program, the hope is that there will be a $30 option for low-income folks that pays the entire cost of 120 service. And then on what you were mentioning about technology, the bill is generally tech neutral, but it's clearly biased. The speed requirements are clearly biased toward more future-proof technology, which today is fiber. And generally that's a good thing where it's economical. On the other hand, fixed wireless can be far less expensive and faster to deploy. So there's kind of a distinction, which is that areas that are served only by satellite broadband, such as what SpaceX is deploying, or fixed wireless access using unlicensed spectrum like Wi-Fi, is considered unserved. So states can prioritize building wireline networks in those areas, which is fine. At the same time, states can still fund fixed wireless access in unserved or underserved areas but it must be 100, down and 20 up. And community Wi-Fi networks are, have an incredible return on investment and are also possible, although they wouldn't be prioritized. So I can maybe mention more about this later, but places like Council Bluffs, Iowa, where the school district built out a network, a Wi-Fi network in partnership with their municipality that not only connects students directly at home in low-income areas, but then is a backup network for anyone in the community who needs Wi-Fi, who needs internet access.
So thank you, Michael. Let's stick with the infrastructure law for just another minute, because I'd love to hear from each of you on what your concerns are. We've been talking about how great it is and all the great things we can do with it, but we also know how broadband funding has been spent in the past and it hasn't necessarily done the job. So I just love to hear what mistakes we should avoid making with this funding if we truly want to close the digital divide and digital skills gaps for students, and any advice you have for states that are going to be applying for this funding, because it's really going to come down to their plans and their grant applications. I'm going to start with you again, Jisoo.
Thanks. I'll just chime in here to add that we shouldn't consider equity a checkbox as we do this work, and deeply consider what it means to engage with stakeholders as the broadband dollars become deployed. Through our DEAR initiative that I mentioned, we quickly learned that different populations and subpopulations of learners, families, and communities face very unique barriers. We know students of color are among the most disconnected populations, but our Latin and Hispanic students face very different barriers compared to Black students or Native students or AAPI students. Our immigrant and migratory students also need specialized supports. We know students with disabilities, students impacted by judicial systems, and students who are experiencing homelessness also face unique challenges when it comes to this issue of the digital divide. So we need to make sure that those unique barriers are accounted for as states plan their BEAD spending and Digital Equity Act dollar spending. And OET will share insights around those unique barriers and suggest strategies to get around them in our upcoming publication. And I'll just share one quick story. When the Office of Ed Tech did our roundtable with parent communities, especially, we had an organization who was able to translate for Burmese refugee families and students that joined that call. And that organization had been actively helping those families look for affordable internet options and get technical support since the beginning of the pandemic. And this helped me realize those specialized supports that some of our families and students need. And I don't think we often recognize the power and the leverage that these intermediary organizations have in advancing digital equity. So that's the only thing I wanted to add, to make sure that we're not using equity as a checkbox as those dollars become deployed, and we really engage those community-based assets, community-based organizations as we do this work.
Great point. Heather, same question for you.
I think one thing that, as excited as I am, I also recognize the complexity of it all. It's a very big and complicated $65 billion program. So I hope that the state broadband offices get the help they need in order to get this work done. And as Jisoo said, in terms of equity, it's not a checkbox issue, but making sure you're bringing to the table the different community anchor institution and local stakeholders that can help in developing these plans. One thing that I noticed in the conversations that were taking place in the past few months is that because BEAD, that's the infrastructure part, it's so big and so complicated, I felt the digital equity part of it was becoming a little bit of an afterthought. So I'm hoping that as they work toward building these plans, they bring in the help they need, whether it is subcontracting, subawarding to other local entities to help in doing that work, so that we are not back here 10 years from now having the same conversation. We are talking about a new technology and a new digital divide moving further along. So
absolutely. Michael, same question for you.
Yeah, I have a, I'll be an echo of sorts, because I have the same primary concern, which is that we integrate sustainable adoption and inclusion activities along with, all this infrastructure, which is 2/3 of the funding, and then the subsidies, the $30 subsidies for monthly service, because as we said, although it's a $65 billion program, only $2.75 billion is earmarked explicitly for digital equity activities, for digital inclusion activities. That's the Digital Equity Act that was built into this. And although there's a requirement to have a plan for both, it could easily become an afterthought. It's also not enough resources, which is why we've been promoting, in parallel, this Airwaves for Equity, to see if we can get a sustainable way. Because one mistake we need to avoid, a decade ago, after the Great Recession, there was the American Recovery Act, and part of that was the Broadband Technology Opportunity Program. And it paid for a couple years for some community-based efforts for broadband adoption. But as soon as that money ran out, most of those community-based efforts went out of business. And so there wasn't the sustained effort, the sustained presence to build the trust, to do all the things, to troubleshoot, to keep the library hours up, and so on. And then finally, I'd mention, I hope there is more attention to these community networks, not to compete with or replace, the really great cable and fiber networks that most of us, pay $75 a month for. But things like I mentioned in Council Bluffs, Iowa, or in the east side of San Jose, which is a predominantly low-income and Hispanic community, where a community Wi-Fi network, a partnership between school district and the municipality, provides a fallback network. It connects the kids directly, and they have unlimited use, but there's at least a low bandwidth option for members of the community. That's both a fallback network, it's an amenity for any visitors or anybody, and it provides resiliency in case of anybody has an outage in any other network.
And thank you, Michael. And Rosemary, it's just same question for you. Anything you want to see us avoid with this funding?
It's not much different from the rest of the panel. I mean, I would just say the state planning, I think, offers a real opportunity, especially because there's funding behind it, for us to be much better coordinated. I've seen in our nation's workforce job training system, we require state planning. We require all these different agencies at the state level to come together, from the welfare agencies to the job training, the education agencies to the some of the transportation. They're all supposed to come together and sort of write this whole plan. And in many cases, or in some cases, I say they do, and they're really comprehensive about it, and they're really thoughtful. But in other cases, they just sort of have these meetings, they get together and they staple their individual plans together and present it to the federal government as one holistic approach. I would hate to see something like that happen in this situation. It would be a shame. And I think that the federal government really, we have a real opportunity here to really require coordination in a sustainable approach.
Great point. So I want to talk a little bit about the FCC's role in addressing digital equity and inclusion for students. Michael, you've been touching on this a bit, so I'm going to start with you here. Just to note, most of the funding for broadband is coming down through the NTIA, but the FCC is still charged with several programs that will have an impact on students and digital equity. That includes the Affordable Connectivity Program, which we've been talking a bit about, which provides a broadband subsidy of up to $30 a month for low-income households. That goes up to $75 for households on tribal land, and there's also a subsidy for devices. So Michael, coming to you first, what are your thoughts on how the rollout of the ACP is going so far? Is it reaching the communities that need it? And what else could the FCC do that would have the biggest impact on students?
Right. Yeah. So as part of the FCC side of this bill, it is to manage the Affordable Connectivity Program, which is the $30 subsidy, or $75 in certain tribal and rural areas. So that's really important. It's $14 billion, which may last a few years. It's probably lasting longer than it should, in part because the enrollment is not what it should be yet. Only one out of, I think they're only at about 25% of eligible households have enrolled for the subsidy, and eligibility is pretty broad, which is good. It includes all the if you've qualified for a direct assistance program like Medicaid, SNAP, Pell Grants, etc. But only one in four is not good, which is why we need more hands-on community efforts. In the long term, the ACP should become an entitlement that mostly takes the onus off schools to connect, students to their network. Because if every household, had a means-tested ability to get low-cost service, then we probably wouldn't need most of these efforts. In the short term, the FCC is also administering the Emergency Connectivity Fund for schools and libraries, which was passed last year, not in the bipartisan infrastructure bill, but earlier in the relief plan. And it was larger than most of us expected, 12 billion, but even that's running out by this fall. And that's what has sort of mitigated the remote learning crisis until now, except we'll be going back to a really bad homework gap again soon. So a promising approach is, which I believe the chairwoman of the FCC, Jessica Rosenworcel, supports, is to expand E-rate again. In other words, the original E-rate only provided connections to schools, like at best, a fiber connection. That's category 1 of E-rate. And then in 2014, it was expanded to include internal connections so that with Wi-Fi, right? So that you could actually you didn't have to march down to the computer lab. You'd have connectivity in every classroom, school-wide. But it doesn't allow any spending for connections off campus, such as connecting low-income kids to the network. So E-rate should provide schools with more funding and more flexibility to connect students directly. Rosenworcel's first step in that regard, I believe, was about 2 weeks ago. She announced a proposal that E-rate should be allowed for school bus Wi-Fi, to allow the school buses to be parked strategically with Wi-Fi, in low-income areas, like in the evenings. So many districts were doing that during the pandemic. And so now that could have a way to get paid for longer term. And we have a petition with the Schools Health Library Broadband Coalition for a more general expansion of E-rate. You might want to call it category 3. Category 2 is Wi-Fi. Category 3 to give school districts flexibility and probably more overall funding to connect, students at home. And we're going to need to work on that in case the Affordable Connectivity Program does not become an entitlement.
Got it. Thank you so much. Heather, same question for you. How do you think the rollout of ACP is going? How can we improve it? And since we are talking about the FCC, if there's anything you can share about the work you're doing as the chair of the Communications Equity and Diversity Council and how it relates here, we would love to hear it.
Thank you, Nicole. First and foremost, I have to separate and compartmentalize how I talk about this, because as the chair for counsel to the FCC, I can't speak on behalf of the FCC. So on behalf of myself and Connected Nation, I agree with we need to continue to promote ACP. The FCC this time, compared to the emergency broadband benefit, listened to what communities said. And so right now there's a lot more money and effort that's going into promotion and empowering local communities to help promote the program. So that's a correct direction for this to go, because we definitely want to make sure that we're maximizing on those dollars. As far as the Communications Equity and Diversity Council, this was commissioned by Chairwoman Rosenworcel in 2021, and its mission is to make recommendations to the FCC on advancing equity in digital communications, whether it's broadband, broadcasting, and anything that's under the purview of the FCC. And the reason why this is important is that it is a diverse group of people representing industry, public interest groups, serve a diverse array of people. And so what we're trying to do is to make sure that any provisions that go out really are factoring equity as far as everyone in the United States without discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, national origin, sex, and disability. And so since we were chartered at a really exciting and a pivotal moment with the infrastructure bill, the chairwoman gave us a very specific task, which is to help with developing model policies and best practices that can be adopted by states and localities to ensure that broad internet service providers do not engage in digital discrimination. Now, this language in this request is very specific in nature because it's in response to a provision in the infrastructure bill that specifically asks the FCC to do this. And it specifically asks the FCC to develop these model states and local policies. So for the sake of adoption by states and localities. That same provision also requires that the FCC adopt rules to facilitate equal access, considering technical and economic feasibility. And so we participated in a public meeting in February, which I can only talk about what's on public record. And right now we are in the process of developing a report that we will present to the commission in July. And it includes what is the definition of digital discrimination, because even though the infrastructure bill points it out as something that the FCC needs to deal with, it actually doesn't have a definition of what digital discrimination is. But what we do know is that redlining is a component of whatever this digital discrimination is. So, and then we have to provide some recommendation of what those local policies and codes need to be, that the FCC will then take and consider as they develop, they respond to the policy request from the infrastructure bill.
Got it. Thank you. Looking forward to keeping up with all of that. Jisoo, similar question for you. Can you share a bit about how the Department of Ed is helping to spread the word about the Affordable Connectivity Program?
Yeah, our collaboration with the FCC, goes back to when the ACP was called the Emergency Broadband Benefit. Fall of last year, we had a chance to convene a listening session for the FCC in collaboration with IMLS and HUD, where the stakeholders we convened noted large gaps in the awareness of the programs like the EBB. So I'm really glad to see that the FCC is doubling down on the awareness campaign behind ACP. Ed is obviously doing our part to support outreach on the ACP. We sent out email notices to Pell recipients last year saying that they qualify for the emergency broadband benefit, and we're gearing up to do the same for the ACP this year. And our higher ed offices are also preparing a webinar tomorrow, actually, for higher ed leaders to learn about the ACP and how they can help eligible students sign up for the benefit. At the Office of EdTech specifically, we collaborated with the FCC and USDA to develop FAQs about the ACP that are relevant to our K-12 stakeholders. We also created resources to make it really easy for schools and districts to communicate with families about their eligibility for the Affordable Connectivity Program. And all of that can be found on tech.ed.gov/ACP.
Fantastic, thank you. And we're just about out of time. So Rosemary, you're gonna get the last word here. A related question for you in switching federal agencies, as someone who previously worked within the Department of Labor, is there anything you'd like to see from that department or other agencies that would improve digital workforce development?
Thank you, Nicole. They are certainly the premier agency when it comes to workforce development. So of course I would like to see them better coordinated with all of this stuff, but this is a little wonky. The Department of Labor actually is an expert at grants management. They distribute $11 billion annually to many of the organizations that are going to get funding from the federal government out of this law. So community colleges, schools, nonprofit organizations, libraries. It would be nice to sort of see the federal government use them not only for their subject matter expertise when it comes to workforce policy, but also in the way in which they are their primary function. They actually know how to deliver grants to these programs, and these programs know how to respond and report. And so it would be good if we could just spend more time, I think, trying to better streamline that process so that these organizations can actually better deliver direct services to the individuals that are most in need.
Very well put. all around. Thank you all so much for your wonderful insights. That brings us to the end of our panel. Unfortunately, I wish I had more time to talk with you all, but I will turn it back to you, Jeff.
Outstanding. Thank you all so much. What a fantastic discussion. There's so many lessons to be pulled from today, from collaboration, the need for coordination, and this is not just one shot, the need to continue these efforts ongoing. So thanks to all our panelists. Thank you, Nicole. Thanks to Senator Thune, Larry Irving, and of course our own SIIA policy team for their insights and for helping to organize this event. A few final updates from us, as Divya noted in her opening comments. Our members are united by a shared belief that diversity, equity, and inclusion are critical core values for society and our individual organizations as well. We believe that achieving greater advancement in DEI and digital equity is not only morally correct, research proves that diverse organizations produce better business results. We remain committed to work with our members and within our own organization to improve DEI performance and outcomes for the benefits of our employees, the industry segments we represent, our nation and society at large. With that in mind, I'm excited to announce the launch of our new DEI microsite that supports our efforts. It provides resources for our members. It helps define and talk about our work in promoting digital equity. So I invite you to visit SIIA.net/DEI and learn more about how we're working to address DEI and promote digital equity. There's a number of articles there and other reference points. So please review and let us know what you think. In conclusion, as we heard today, we've made a lot of positive steps forward, but there's so much more that needs to be done. The challenge looms large, but the opportunities and benefits stand taller or greater. I often say it's easy to be frustrated and pessimistic if we sit in the moment, but if we look back on how far we come, it gives us hope and optimism for the future and how much more we can do. We've led the nation, the industry that's led the world in the development of innovative solutions to the world's greatest challenges can and must also lend that same spirit to increasing equity in the tech sector. So with that, thank you again for attending, and we look forward to seeing you at our next Tech and event. Thank you and have a great afternoon.